Assalamu alaikum, students. So this is the third and the last lecture in the cardiac output series. And in this, we'll be looking at the various methods to measure cardiac output. And we finish things off by looking at cardiac work, uh, which is basically the work done by the heart. And it includes volume work and pressure work. And there are important clinical implications of these two. And we'll be looking up that particular detail as well. So we'll start off with measuring cardiac output. It's a straightforward points. Later on, when you will work in a cardiology unit, these things will form the basis of your practice, which basically you'll be dealing with actual estimations of stroke volume, and of course, heart rate is very basic to measure, and based on your stroke volume and other parameters of cardiac performance, you'll be looking at cardiac output in the clinical setting. However, at this level, we need to understand the basics of what those measurements rely on, and this is where this lecture fits in. So basically, if you remember Fick's law, this law comes in wherever you want to measure things. It states that material, I mean, as far as the law is concerned, material cannot be made neither destroyed, uh, whether it be a gas or liquid or whatever. So if a finite amount of a substance is going into uh, an organ, and then via blood, for example, and then it exists via the same blood. Whatever happens to it within the organ can be measured, since the basic premise is all that thing about stuff not being created, not destroyed. So we extrapolate that in various ways to look at, if you remember in respiration, we looked at helium dilution method that also follows Fick's law. This year, this oxygen method, basically oxygen Fick's method, also relies on Fick's principle. And the one following up, indicator dilution method, that also follows the same principle. So what does oxygen Fick's law mean? By the way, this is a famous university question. It is often asked, and examiners basically expect you to remember this particular one in detail, or at least in fluent detail, uh, when they ask you about cardiac output measurement. Okay. We look at about 4 measurement techniques, this being the first one, and it's really simple. Look, this is the right side of the heart, and this is the left side of the heart. So blood, when it's pumped into the right side, and the right side then pumps it into the lungs, it then becomes oxygenated, and it's received in the left side of the heart. If you look at the oxygen difference in the blood that is being received by the lungs from the right side of the heart, the oxygen concentration is 160 ml per liter, while the blood after oxygenation, the oxygen change is 200 ml per liter. So there you can readily see that there is a difference of 40 ml, and that 40 ml basically is picked up by each liter of blood, right? As you can see, it's 160 ml per liter, 200 ml per liter. So the change, the 40 ml extra, is being carried by each, uh, if you can imagine a hypothetical unit of blood. So each liter of blood passing through will carry extra 40 ml of blood, right? So that's one part of the story. The second part of the story is we know that in the lungs, the oxygen used per minute is 200 ml per minute. Okay, this can be easily used by any device which measures the oxygen entry or oxygen concentration in the inspired air, and then subtracting it with when you expire the air, you're subtracting that from the inspired air oxygen concentration, and you'll know how much per minute is this chap using in terms of oxygen, right? So that's relatively straightforward. These samples can also be taken from venous blood and from arterial blood. So this is a pretty reliable method of practical method of arriving at cardiac output. So what happens? We know that this bit needs to go into blood per minute. This is what happens to the blood when it comes in and out, picking up that 40 ml approximately per liter. So how much would it require to pick up 200 if one, hypothetically, one unit of blood carries 40 ml of oxygen per liter? How much, how many quote unquote units of blood will it require to take up 200 ml? So the answer is basically 5 units, quote unquote, 5 units of that 1 liter blood need to be provided per minute so that you can pick up your 200 ml per minute oxygen price. Okay. And this 5 liters or 5000 ml per minute is your cardiac output. Okay. It's a pretty straightforward discussion about how Fick's principle is used to look at oxygen differences between deoxygenated and oxygenated blood, and the consumption of oxygen overall via the lungs, and extrapolating these three figures to arrive reliably at a cardiac output value. Okay, so that's that. Right. Then we go on to the indicator dilution method. Again, this is a typical use of Fick's law, more in line with what we discussed in the helium dilution method. If you remember, we used a finite amount of helium, and the subject inhaled it. So the chamber that was outside carrying the helium cylinder, that was, that was one chamber, and then the lungs were two chambers. So a typical C1V1 is equal to C2V2 situation was created. And as you know, this simple looking but ingenious equation forms so many, the basis for so many biological and chemistry uh, equations that you must have studied in lab in your undergrad studies. So here also we will use this equation to derive a cardiac output value. The dye in this case is indocyanine green, or nicknamed cardiogreen, and obviously the concentration of cardiogreen, the dye that we will inject, will be known. So that will be depicted by, say, the letter A, okay, known concentration of a dye. And then when we have injected this amount, say around 5 ml, okay, the diluted concentration of the dye in the fluid will be depicted as C, okay. And what is the unknown? What do we want to know? We want to know the fluid in which it has been diluted in, which will reflect the cardiac output. That is denoted by V. So what are we doing exactly? What we are doing is we are at this point here, we are injecting the cardiogreen, okay, a known amount of cardiogreen. And as you can see, then we plot this graph, and this graph basically looks at the dye concentration in the blood plotted against time. So you can see that the concentration does not go up uh, in any significant way in the initial 1 second or two. This is because the dye has been injected directly or as close as possible to the heart itself, and it's passing through the heart. Okay, and now because you are having these serial measurements of the dye from an artery, peripheral artery. Now the concentration starts to rise. Okay, because it has now come in the circulation. When it starts to rise pretty rapidly, it peaks, flattens a bit, and then drops rapidly. Okay. Now, this is where I need to explain something. When it drops and comes here, this is where it's still in the circulation. But at this point, it will enter the heart again, and hence its concentration will go back again. We are not interested in that. We are only interested in one circulation because we want to understand cardiac output for that one circulation. Okay. So what we'll do is from this point onwards, we'll just extrapolate that if there were only one circulation, theoretically speaking, of course, what would have been its value along the projected line, and we'll just finish it off by extending it when it hits the x-axis. Okay, this is standard extrapolation used in mathematics commonly. So by this we get that area under the curve. It's called area under the curve, and this is the average value of the dye. Okay, so you see the problem is when you inject a liquid, a dye or whatever, inside a chamber which has moving blood, a moving liquid. So, for example, in a human body, you have moving blood and you inject something. Uh, the dynamics of this substance in this moving blood is different as compared to when you introduce the same amount of a substance in a beaker, which has static or stationary fluid. Okay, so these are differences. When you do it in a human being, in an alive human being, what happens is typically the concentration in the art in whatever vessel you're measuring it will go up uh, uh, after it has equilibrated with the rest of the fluid in the body. Say it does not get absorbed or metabolized by any tissue in the body, it just stays in blood nicely. Uh, for that to happen, it needs to be equilibrated, then it will rise, and then you can take your value, and then eventually it will come down. So there is a dynamic of the substance that you are injecting. There is an inherent dynamic of the substance itself. You need to be you need to take that into account when you are using this substance to study something else. So in this case, at T1, the concentration will be different. At T2, the concentration will be different. And you are interested in what happened during T1 and T2, because that is your average dye concentration. You're not only interested in when it goes up sharply, you're not only interested in when it plateaus, and you are not interested only in when it comes down. You are interested in all of it. So you need an averaged value of this dye in blood, and that for that you have done all of this extrapolation so that you can get a good understanding of the area under the curve, which gives you the averaged value for the dye. And why are we harping about this diluted concentration or this area under the curve? Because this will reflect our cardiac output. This will reflect the cardiac output because this is where indirectly the dye got diluted by the blood, by the moving blood. So how much did the blood move to dilute this finite amount of dye over time will reflect the cardiac output. Okay. So I'll say it again another way. The blood was moving. Imagine the blood was moving. Imagine a straight line, a straight tube. At point A, you injected a finite amount of the dye, right? And the blood was moving through that tube. So how will you find out how much the blood has gone through a certain point? By calculating or by measuring uh, the diluted dye blood down the stream in the same tube. And by that, you will have an idea how much blood would have passed through point A to dilute this dye to its current situation. Yes? So that if you understand that simple model, obviously the cardiovascular system is much more complex. And you have to go through all of these averaged values and area under the curve and stuff to understand what's going on. So we've done this, we've done the graph. Now just put the values in the formula. C1 V1 is equal to C2 V2, and we arrive at A is equal to A being the known amount of dye is equal to C, which is the diluted amount, which of course in this case will be C average, okay, which is basically depicted here. So C average multiplied by the unknown volume, and this will reflect the cardiac output. You solve this for cardiac output, you keep the V here, and C goes tucked underneath A, and this is the final picture that you get. V is equal to A over C. Okay, so the known amount of dye divided by the diluted amount, average diluted amount, will give you a good picture of the cardiac output. Okay, and this is uh, the formula. Now remember, in Guyton, you have the same information, but I find that it's a bit complicated. However, the more mathematically minded people will probably benefit from that description. This is more of a simpler overview description. So people are, of course, invited to read that description and Guyton and clarify your concepts. Of course, the formula over there is this same formula, mind you, but it's slightly different. He has multiplied this amount by 60 and hence removed the need for an averaged amount of the dye at the bottom of this fraction. So it's really the same formula as Director mentions it, but this one is more simpler, and I find this is more student friendly. Okay, so this is indicator dilution method. Thermodilution is again the same thing, the tube thing that I discussed, where you took a point A and you injected your dye and all that thing. You'll be able to understand that much more easily here in thermodilution, of course. And the second more important thing is this is the more preferred way to measure cardiac output in clinical practice. Uh, these are specialized catheters. Catheters are long, flexible, rubbery, flexible tubes that we use in all sorts of procedures in the clinical practice. This particular catheter is specialized in the sense that it has a side pocket. So it has a tip. It's a long tube, right? It's a long tube with a pointed tip, not very pointed, roundish tip. Okay, and just before the tip on the side, a a a, a technique, a what you call a way to introduce something inside wherever you put this catheter in. Okay, it's like a pocket or an opening, right? And so that's one feature of this tube. And right at the tip of this tube, you have a thermistor. You have a temperature evaluating or temperature sensing sensor. Okay. Now, when you take this catheter, you insert it through a peripheral vessel, and you keep on pushing it till it literally ends up inside the heart, in the right side of the heart. Okay. Now, when it's there, from the side port, that's the pocket that I mentioned just before the tip. You have a side pocket or side opening. From the side port, you introduce from outside. You introduce ice cold water, ice cold saline into the right heart. Okay, now stay with me. So your catheter is inside the right heart. Okay, and through that side opening, you just push through. It's like a drip. Okay, it's very similar like a drip, but this is a more specialized kind of drip, and it has gone into the body through the vessel and into the right side of the heart. Okay, it also has a marking, a marking which can be picked up on an X-ray. Okay, so you know if it's an ultrasound guided or an X-ray guided technique, you know where your tube is going and how and where it's moving along. Okay, so you know you are in the chamber when you hit the chamber. Right. So when you introduce the ice cold saline into the right heart, now that very cold water will obviously decrease the temperature of the blood that it has been released in. Now this blood, when it goes through the right AV valve into the pulmonary artery, that is where the tip of the thermistor is. Okay, so you have wedged your catheter in a way that the tip has gone through the valve into the pulmonary artery, or as much down the stream as you can. Okay, so The ice cold saline gets released proximally inside the ventricle, and the thermistor lies waiting inside the pulmonary artery. You see what's going on. You decrease the temperature of blood inside the ventricle, so that now this is cold blood. And when it goes through the valve and it goes through the pulmonary artery, it is picked up by the cold blood is picked up by the temperature measuring sensor at the tip of this catheter. Okay. And the amount of that cold blood per minute is calculated, and voila, that is cardiac output. Okay. So that's an ingenious way again to measure cardiac output. And it's of course a variation of the indication dilution method, and similar equations are used in this procedure. Then the last one here is we use echocardiography, or briefly you must have heard echo. So this is a technique to understand, to study the heart in myocardial infarctions and other issues. Ultrasound waves are used to study the heart, and two main things are picked up: the size of the chambers, the internal size, and the velocity of blood flowing through the heart, especially from the left ventricle to the aorta. Stroke volume is calculated using the velocity of the blood, which goes into aorta, and the cross-sectional area of the aorta. Both of these are used to arrive at a mathematical value of stroke volume. Okay, so basically, how much blood was thrown into the aorta by the contracting ventricle, and what change in the aorta uh, took place to accommodate this incoming blood, which will give you an idea of course, how much blood was pushed from the ventricle into the aorta. So again, this is a very interesting and nice way to study cardiac output, a more direct way rather. So we are using ultrasound waves to measure stroke volume live right then and there, and then just multiply that with the heart rate. And as you know, that stroke volume into heart rate is cardiac output, and you get a value for cardiac output. So that's that. These are the important ways of measuring cardiac output. We move on to cardiac work, and cardiac work basically is of two types. One is volume work, and the other is pressure work. Simply put, volume work is the amount of work, the effort that is required or is done by the heart in the physical throwing or ejection of blood into the ventricles. This happens when the aortic valves, if we are talking about the left ventricle work. So let's take that as an example, because it does more work, because it is connected to the systemic circulation and all that. So when it throws its blood, its stroke volume from inside the ventricle into the aorta after the opening of the aortic valve, that work, that component of the work, which is a fraction of the total work, of course, that is called the volume work. Okay. This work is made possible by this work, which is the pressure work. So if you just go through your cardiac cycle in your mind now, right now, and you just remember what happens during isovolumetric contraction, just before ejection, what happens when the ventricle is contracting in a closed chamber with all the valves closed? What is happening there? You're stretching the elastic tissues, you're overcoming internal viscosities, you are literally rearranging the musculature of the heart, so that, and remember, the chamber is closed. Okay, so whatever is happening in the spot, it's happening with the lid down. Okay, it's all cooking inside with all lids, all valves closed. So this work is designed to increase pressure before you can eject blood at a higher velocity. For you to be able to do that, eject blood at higher velocity, you need to mount a lot of pressure within a closed chamber. This is called pressure work. Okay, pressure work. So pressure work happens first, and then volume work happens. If you just follow the cardiac cycle, the basic cardiac cycle. Now, these two concepts have implications. Okay, And the number one implication is for oxygen consumption. So pressure work, we say, is more quote unquote expensive than volume work. Okay. Uh, it's said in another way. It's a very interesting way of saying it. Is that if you increase afterload, that will cause a greater consumption of oxygen by the myocardium than it would have happened if you had increased preload. Now, let me just talk a bit about this. What is afterload and what is preload is something that you need to understand, obviously, before attempting to understand this concept. Afterload is, as we have been talking, is the pressure against which the ventricle is contracting. Okay, so basically blood pressure inside the aorta, or the situation of the aortic valve. If it's stenotic, if it's narrowed, then you know, or if there is hypertension in the person, then we say that afterload has increased. Okay. What is preload? Preload is the amount of blood that is coming by venous return into the heart. So that's done. Now we are saying that the myocardial oxygen consumption gets enhanced. It requires more oxygen, comes under a load. The coronaries go in overdrive, trying to get enough oxygen to this myocardium if the afterload increases as compared to preload. Of course, if we increase the preload, Frank's running law dictates that the heart will contract more. But when we compare afterload and preload, very important point here is if we increase afterload, uh, for each degree increase in afterload, the increase in oxygen consumption will be much more than each degree increase in preload. So the heart is actually happy dealing with more blood coming in, and it's happy to contract and get rid of it. Then when it has to contract against an increased aortic pressure or against a stenotic aortic valve. Yes. So that's a very important point, that pressure work uh, 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 makes you pay much more than volume work. Okay. The Frank-Starling law versus this increased afterload scenario can be used in MCQs and Viva questions. It's a very interesting point. And by using this, now the question which you will be hopefully answering in the comment section below this video is this scenario. In angina, and angina is basically ischemic pain in the myocardium. It's a prelude to infarction. So when there is not enough oxygen delivery to the myocardium becomes ischemic. Ischemia is a painful situation, whether it's in the myocardium or elsewhere. And that is the pain that you get with a heart attack. So that's called angina. So which one, aortic stenosis or aortic regurgitation, would produce more angina? Okay, angina we have defined here. I'll wait for your comments, uh, and let's see who gets it right. So this is one important thing, one important concept. And the second is, again, it draws upon what we were discussing, the Frank-Starling law versus sympathetic stimulation, which has implications for what in terms of cardiac work. Okay, so load enhancement, i.e., if we are talking about Frank-Starling law, just remember, don't be bogged down by this long term here. We are basically talking about Frank-Starling law. We are basically talking about preload increase. Okay, so oxygen consumption increases when you increase stroke volume by increasing preload. Remember, there are other ways of increasing stroke volume as well. The other way is enhancing the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, that's another way. And by increasing the preload, increasing the amount of blood via venous return, is also a way of increasing stroke volume. So there are two ways of increasing stroke volume. And if you're looking at the oxygen consumption via this way, via increasing the preload, the law of Laplace comes back and visits you. Okay, if you remember, We talked about law of Laplace when we were talking about wall tension, when we were talking about myogenic mechanism or autoregulation during the local blood flow control chapter of circulation. Okay, and it says that the wall tension basically, if you stretch a vessel, if you stretch it, the radius increases, the tension developed in the wall increases, and so does the oxygen consumption. Okay, this is basically law of Laplace. So when the preload increases, i.e., the venous return increases, it stretches the myocardium and the ventricle. The radius increases, the tension developed increases, and oxygen consumption also increases. Okay. Now, this opposed to sympathetic stimulation. So in this sympathetic stimulation, we know that the heart is stimulated to not only increase the number of contractions, but each contraction, the amount of force that it develops also increases. We call this thing contractility. Remember, contractility is a distinct quality of the myocardium. It's not contraction, it's contractility. Contractility is basically conceptually the force of each contraction. And sympathetic stimulation has this ability to increase that force of contraction by enhancing the calcium sensitivity of the myocardium. So it does not mess with the radius or the stretch. Yes, it basically increases cardiac performance by manipulating calcium. So it does not deal with the stretching and the radius and all that stuff. Hence, the oxygen consumption, as compared to oxygen consumption by increasing preload, in increasing contractility by the sympathetics, the oxygen consumption is lesser, more efficient than loading induced contraction via the Frank-Starling law. Okay, let me give you some perspective here quickly. This here we discussed overall, we compared afterload with preload. Yes. So this slide we discussed, if you increase the afterload or if you increase the preload, which one will cost you more oxygen? And we said increased afterload is more expensive. So more heart attacks happen, more pressure comes on the heart when you increase afterload. Here we are discussing that we are now not discussing afterload. We are discussing that if you were to increase stroke volume and the afterload is constant, which two ways are there to increase stroke volume? We said one is the Frank-Starling law, which we say that increase the preload, and the second is sympathetic stimulation induced enhanced contractility. Now in this slide we compare these two, which one is more oxygen efficient, and we said now you get the context here. So here we said that Frank-Starling law induced contraction, enhanced in stroke volume, basically because of Laplace law leads to more oxygen consumption than a mechanism which does not enhance the stretch or radius. It enhances the quality of the contraction itself by making the myocardium more calcium responsive. Okay, so this is also has direct implications on the quality of work that the heart performs. Okay, these are the references. This basically concludes our cardiac output series, and from the next lecture we'll be looking at exercise changes, then we're looking at cardiac failure and so on, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.